ultimate screen boogeyman. But whether creating the classic film roles of the Frankenstein Monster and the Mummy, or whether he was playing Mandarin sorcerers and grave-robbing body snatchers, Boris Karloff always imbued his villains with a certain vulnerability. But the real Boris Karloff was a tortured soul of a different sort. As a classically trained British actor, he yearned to play more sympathetic and sophisticated roles. And he was also fiercely protective of his privacy and shunned investigations into his personal life, a life that was shrouded in secrecy. Tonight, Biography looks at this secret side of Boris Karloff.
Don't be alarmed. The woman who just screamed is perfectly quiet now.
Boris Karloff scared the hell out of me.
You're afraid of me, aren't you?
He's got this wonderful kind of voice that takes you in.
I leave my secret with you. She's all there.
He was underrated as an actor because his fame was so enormous.
Boris Karloff, the one, the only, king of monsters.
My father really was a gentle soul. I don't think he scared anybody. Not in real life, he never did.
For most of the 20th century, the name Boris Karloff became synonymous with terror. But the actor who gained his greatest fame as the Frankenstein Monster was, in fact, a well-educated British gentleman. Born William Henry Pratt in the London suburb of Camberwell on November 23, 1887. The youngest of 9 children born to Edward John Pratt, Jr. and his wife Eliza, Billy Pratt was provided with a mixed heritage, reflective of his parents' roots in the British diplomatic service.
Most of his family were all very, very high in the British government. They were all government servants. And his father had been working as some member of the government in India, which one assumes is where he met his mother. He was very, very dark, and his family was East Indian on his mother's side. And he always had this very heavy color. And in a British school, you know, with his coloring, friends used to say, you know, you must spend an awful lot of time in the sun. And how do you get that tan? And Boris always said, well, plenty of gin and a tight collar, and that's the way I got it.
When John Pratt abandoned his family to live in France, 5-year-old Billy was left in the care of his mother and older siblings. But Eliza's death just 2 years later would deal the young boy an emotional blow from which he would never recover.
I don't think he had a warm, cuddly childhood or family life. I think that his older brothers would come home and would knock him about a bit and go off again. And I don't think he had fond memories, and he never talked about it.
After playing the Demon King in a parish production of Cinderella, 9-year-old Billy became fascinated by the theater. But it was Gerald du Maurier's flamboyant interpretation of Captain Hook in a London stage production of Peter Pan some years later that got the young boy hooked on acting.
All he wanted to do was to become an actor, and he did whatever it took to pursue that lifelong dream.
Despite strong pressure to enter the diplomatic service, Billy Pratt dropped out of King's College at the University of London. At 21, he pocketed his modest inheritance and sailed on the Empress of Britain to seek a new life, far from his judgmental family. Arriving in Montreal, Canada on May 17, 1909, the aspiring actor worked his way west, taking employment as a farmhand and manual laborer. Within a year, he had reached British Columbia, where he exaggerated his credentials and was hired as an actor with the Gene Russell Players, a traveling stock company. It was here for the first time that William Henry Pratt adopted the stage name Boris Karloff. The surname, he said, from a Russian name on his mother's side, and Boris from thin air.
My father never took Boris Karloff legally. It was an AKA. All his legal papers were signed William Henry Pratt, a.k.a. Boris Karloff. His contracts were signed Boris Karloff. I don't know if that makes him legal or illegal.
But Boris's budding career was cut short in Regina, Saskatchewan. In the summer of 1912, a devastating tornado destroyed the town, killing 41 people and leaving the company's theater and scenery in ruins. Karloff returned to menial jobs until another stock company, the Harry St. Clair Players, hired him for 3 seasons. It's during this period that Boris is thought to have married a Canadian actress named Olive de Wilton, but no record of this union survives. After emigrating to the United States in 1913, he quit the St. Clair Players and, following a theatrical stint in Chicago, settled in Los Angeles, home of the rapidly expanding motion picture industry. His first confirmed screen employment was as an extra in this Douglas Fairbanks vehicle, His Majesty the American. More screen work followed, including a featured role as a Huron Indian in The Last of the Mohicans. But life wasn't easy for a Hollywood actor, even one as versatile as Boris Karloff.
He was absolutely poverty-stricken and hungry most of the time, but he had what he always referred to as the fire in his belly for the craft. He just had it. And he said his favorite thing was canned mulligatawny soup, because he would make one meal out of the soup part and another meal out of the vegetables that were in it. It was that bad. He was starving most of the time.
It was also during this period that the young Karloff would be married and divorced 2 more times. In July of 1920 to a musician named Montana Lorena Williams, and again in February of 1924 to Helene Vivian Soule, a Hollywood actress and dancer.
Those were days when he was running his trade. He was as often, I think, driving a truck, loading a truck, or unloading a freight car as much as he was making films in those days to make ends meet.
By now, Boris was working steadily, mostly in bit parts and character roles, and usually as a villain. His dark, brooding eyes and exotic coloring recommended him to play everything from Arab sheiks and gangsters to a Moroccan bartender, seen here in a recently discovered silent film entitled Sharpshooters.
He could be very villainous. He could be debonair. He could be handsome. He could be ugly. He could do a lot of things with very little makeup, and so he was a very versatile actor.
Karloff's most important role to date was as the macabre mesmerist in The Bells, opposite Lionel Barrymore. A role patterned, it seems, after this German expressionist horror classic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In 1928, the advent of sound threatened to expose another of Karloff's pronounced characteristics.
Art thou prepared for the execution?
Somebody said, what about his lisp?
Summon the executioner.
But he could do most anything with his voice. Be very sinister, but also be very soothing, very pleasant, very cultured.
2 years later, Boris tied the knot again, this time to a woman named Dorothy Stein.
She was a librarian, and he had just begun to get some better parts when they married. But he was an unknown.
To a character actor like Boris Karloff, there was perhaps no greater hero than Lon Chaney. His unique gift for creating grotesque makeups and horrifying characterizations made him one of the screen's first superstars. But while preparing for the role of Dracula in Universal Pictures' film version of the successful stage play, Chaney was stricken with throat cancer and died in 1930. Desperate to find a successor to their Man of 1,000 Faces, Universal producers decided to gamble on the Hungarian actor who had created the part on Broadway, Bela Lugosi.
I am Dracula.
Dracula, the original terrifying story of a man who lived after death.
The film's tremendous success made the dashing actor an international star. Now billed as the new Lon Chaney, Universal quickly announced that Lugosi would star in a film adaptation of another Gothic masterpiece, Frankenstein.
He thought that a script which had virtually no dialogue at all was not something he wanted to do. And he also realized that the makeup was so heavy that his abilities as an actor wouldn't be used the way that he thought they should, and he turned down the role.
With Lugosi out, Universal executives assigned the task of casting the monster to a new director, the brilliant and eccentric James Whale. In his search for an actor who could convincingly play the part of a creature stitched together from the bodies of dead convicts, Whale noticed a 43-year-old actor who was receiving industry attention in Howard Hawks' taut prison drama, The Criminal Code.
Howard Hawks picked Karloff to play the same part he'd done on the stage. He was so impressed with him. And the character of Galloway, you can see the Frankenstein monster for the first time.
During a chance meeting with Boris in the Universal Studios commissary, Whale is rumored to have said, "Your face, Mr. Karloff, has interesting possibilities." Biography's look at Boris Karloff will continue. Frankenstein, little did the 43-year-old actor realize the impact the film would have on his life and on the audience.
When Frankenstein was first released, it was as gigantic an onslaught as like E.T. Nothing had ever been seen like it.
Throw the switches.
The scene in which the monster is brought to life remains one of the most unforgettable moments in motion picture history.
When we first see this scarred hand and Colin Clive saying it's moving.
It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Well, I thought it was just the greatest picturization of fantasy and horror that I had ever seen. Karloff brought a real pathos to it. There's the sequence which unfortunately was excised from the film for many, many years, where the monster's down by the lake with the little girl.
See how mine floats?
She shows him a little game that she can take a daisy and throw it in the lake, and it floats, and he likes that. But eventually they run out of daisies, and he's, more, this is fun. And so you sort of see a gleam in his eye. Well, wait a minute, daisies float. I guess little girls float.
No, you're hurting me! No!
Boris Karloff himself had kind of a negative reaction to that scene. He felt that it made him appear rather monstrous, but I don't see any evil intent at all. He doesn't do it out of malice, evil, anything of that nature, just out of naivete.
I became aware of the humanity of somebody who was deformed or a creature. And I think probably that was the most moving thing about Frankenstein.
Adding immeasurably to the actor's performance was one of the most inspired character makeups of all time, designed by the legendary makeup artist Jack Pierce.
Jack Pierce certainly conceived it, but Karloff added to it. He added the eyelids that gave the creature a more dead look. He took out a part of his teeth to give it an indenture into his cheek, giving an added dimension to that facial look of the monster.
Multiple layers of cheesecloth, putty, and toxic industrial chemicals were used to create the monster's distinctive look. It was a painstaking process that took over 4 hours to apply and had to be repeated from scratch every day.
Boris would have to start the makeup at 4 in the morning, and Boris never had any breakfast except something horrible to me, which was orange juice with 2 raw eggs thrown into it. The combination of a Karloff makeup and raw eggs and orange juice was not attractive.
The price Karloff paid to bring his character to life was great. Encased in a heavily padded costume weighing 65 pounds, his feet dragging 30-pound weighted boots, Karloff worsened a chronic back condition that would soon send him to the hospital for spinal treatment. Although he had been represented in Frankenstein's opening titles by an ambiguous question mark, Boris Karloff had become a superstar. The character actor who had spent a quarter-century in obscurity was now so famous that within a year, he would be billed using his last name alone, an honor previously reserved for screen immortals like Valentino, Barrymore, and Garbo.
The Mummy. Is it dead or alive? Human or inhuman? You'll know. You'll see. There's nothing on earth like The Mummy.
You will not remember what I show you now, and yet I shall awaken memories of love and crime and death.
In 1933, after an absence of nearly 25 years, Boris Karloff returned to his native England to film The Ghoul, the first British horror film of the talking era. It was during this trip that the former Billy Pratt was reunited with three of his surviving brothers who had to accept the fact that their black sheep sibling had in fact made good in the world. Returning to Hollywood and in great demand, Boris expanded his range with diverse and memorable portrayals as the religious fanatic in John Ford's The Lost Patrol, and as the anti-Semitic aristocrat in The House of Rothschild.
Your bid was received, Mr. Rothschild. But to put it as delicately as possible, it was thrown out, shall we say, on a technicality.
You mean, in brief, I am a Jew?
Likewise, in brief, I do.
By 1934, Universal Pictures had their two leading horror stars back under contract, and they wasted no time in teaming Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi in a series of now classic films.
Poison. Everyone I touch is poisoned. They die.
By now, the press was making much of the fact that Karloff was getting the better end of the screen partnership, and that the British-born Boris was more versatile than his thickly accented Hungarian co-star. Some even speculated that Lugosi resented Karloff's ever-increasing fame and popularity.
Their professional relationship, as far as my dad told me, was one of respect for each other. My father did have some remorse about turning down the Frankenstein role, but that was the only competition among them. There was no personal animosity between my dad and Boris Karloff.
Ready for the test, Dracula? I'm ready, Frankenstein. Then let us begin. You understand, Bela, don't you? That the one who wins this little game of chess is to lead the parade at the film stars' frolic.
Okay, boys. You'll move.
Right.
In fact, Karloff harbored animosity toward no one, and he was well known for his many acts of personal generosity.
I was working as a reader at Selznick, and he said, "You shouldn't be a reader, you should be a writer." And I said, "Well, one of these days I'll get a typewriter and I'll try." And the next day a typewriter arrived by the front door.
Standing in sharp contrast to his horrifying screen roles were the actor's deep convictions on social and political matters.
Very liberal, very, very liberal gentleman. He couldn't stand injustice.
Because of the pain and suffering he endured while filming Frankenstein, no one was better aware of the often grueling demands being made on his fellow screen performers than Boris Karloff. He became an activist for actors' rights, and he was a key organizer of the Screen Actors Guild.
And at that time, that was a professionally dangerous thing to be involved with. It was a union, and it was not popular with the studios at all.
It was literally dangerous. They had to make calls from public telephones, and they had to meet in secret and not leave their cars outside the house of the others. They'd have to park blocks away because it was that dangerous to form a guild at that time.
He was a man of deep conviction and great passions. He was proud of his involvement with it, really proud of it.
At home, Boris exemplified the dignity and taste of a cultured English gentleman.
He was a passionate, avid reader. His favorite author was Conrad. His real passion was cricket. I mean, he just lived and breathed cricket. In his younger days, he played tennis. He loved gardening.
My picture in my mind of Boris always is out watering his roses, wearing what he called me wickies, which there was apparently shorts, And he used to go out with his wickies and a top hat to water the roses, and it was quite a sight.
The monster! It's alive!
In 1935, Boris donned the monster's makeup for a second time in The Bride of Frankenstein, one of the rare Hollywood sequels considered superior to its original. Conceived by director James Whale as a sardonic black comedy, studio publicity made much of the fact that in this version, the monster talks.
You make man like me? No. Woman. Woman. Friend. Why?
Karloff, however, had serious misgivings about bestowing the monster with speech, feeling that it compromised the integrity of his original characterization. Fortunately, audiences didn't agree, and the film went on to become an international sensation. But the tide of the world market was changing. The storm clouds of war gathering over Europe prompted public concern over the effect Hollywood horror films might have on national morale. The powerful British Board of Film Censors threatened an embargo, and nervous Hollywood executives avoided producing the kinds of films in which Boris Karloff excelled.
You haven't changed, have you? But I have.
Karloff's Hollywood assignments were cut in half for nearly 3 years.
I will not allow that machine to be used for criminal purposes.
His parts now tended toward B pictures, usually the bottom half of double bills and kiddie matinees. The monster boom of the early 30s had gone bust. But Boris had known tough times before. And just like Dr. Frankenstein, he knew that nothing stays dead forever. Biography's look at Boris Karloff will continue. Of a nearly bankrupt Los Angeles theater staged a desperate stunt by booking Frankenstein and Dracula on a double bill. It started a sensation. Boris Karloff was back, and the 50-year-old actor agreed to tackle the rigors of the monster makeup for a third time.
Edison, turn on the generator. Produced on a vast scale, Son of Frankenstein presents the most fearsome cast in the history of the screen.
These candid shots of the Son of Frankenstein is the only color footage of my father in the Frankenstein makeup. It shows him clowning around on the set with Jack Pierce, the genius makeup artist. And the nice thing is it shows my father's humor and his gentleness of spirit coming through, because to clown around in that makeup must not have been very comfortable to do.
Although there was much to recommend it, Karloff felt The Son of Frankenstein was a pale imitation of its predecessors. But Boris's disappointment during production was offset by the arrival of his first and only child, a daughter named Sarah Jane, born November 23rd, 1938.
I was born on my father's birthday, which makes me probably the most expensive birthday present he ever got.
Despite the success of Son of Frankenstein, Boris was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the kinds of roles he was being offered. Anxious for new challenges, he accepted an offer from theatrical producers Howard Lindsay and Russell Krauss to star in his first Broadway play, a black comedy entitled Arsenic and Old Lace. His role as Jonathan Brewster, a homicidal dead ringer for a certain actor named Boris Karloff, was tailor-made.
He gets out of a chest by a window, and when he gets out saying something about he looks like Boris Karloff, the audience just absolutely broke up. He was hilarious.
Arsenic and Old Lace became one of the longest-running plays in the history of the American theater. It also established Boris Karloff as a legitimate actor and a major star.
Here, in the midst of gaiety and splendor, lurks a monster of psychological horror.
Tonight you give your voice and your will to me.
Starring the terrorizing star of Arsenic and Old Lace, Boris Karloff.
Despite his much heralded return to Universal in the climax, Boris's Hollywood offerings were still limited to low-budget thrillers like The House of Frankenstein, appearing this time not as the monster, but as its maker.
I'm going to give that brain of yours a new home in the skull of the Frankenstein Monster.
Of course, low budgets could, on occasion, produce films of high quality, as Boris discovered when he signed with RKO Studios and producer Val Lewton to appear in a series of tightly budgeted but highly effective suspense thrillers.
Karloff's words were, "Val Lewton rescued my soul." He and Val Lewton were both well-educated, literate men, and they wanted to present literate horror films.
Their first effort, based on Robert Louis Stevenson's The Body Snatcher, showcased Karloff as homicidal grave robber John Gray. It also marked his final screen pairing with his old friend, Bela Lugosi.
You and I should work together.
You mean we would sell the bodies to the doctors together? Dig them up.
There'll be no digging. The kirkyards are too well guarded.
Boris was very, very keen to do this particular role because he realized that this was his chance to show that he really was a top actor and not just some kind of a man to play monsters. And that was, I think, what drove him to want to do the film and to work as hard as he did it. He was not particularly well. He was having a lot of back problems, but he just buried that and just gave every bit of himself possible.
Following The Body Snatcher, Karloff continued his association with Val Lewton in two of the most atmospheric films of the 1940s, Isle of the Dead and Bedlam, co-starring Anna Lee.
It was the story of St. Mary's of Bethlehem Hospital in London, which is still a hospital for the insane. And I remember Boris used to get quite irritated when people called it a horror picture, because he said it's not a horror picture, it's a historical picture, which it was.
Karloff's frustrations at being typed as Hollywood's premier boogeyman were soon overshadowed by a crisis in his personal life. Unknown to even their closest friends, the marriage of Boris and his wife Dorothy was collapsing.
I don't have the faintest clue what went wrong. But at the same time, he married my stepmother the day after the divorce was final.
On April 11th, 1946, Boris Karloff married his fifth wife, Evelyn Hope Helmore, a close friend of the Karloff family.
Evie was a very charming, very attractive, very humorous lady, and I couldn't have been more surprised. You know, this was Dorothy's best friend. It was around the house all the time, and it stunned me. Then I got used to it. And she took superb care of him, and she helped him in his work, and I think they loved each other a great deal.
During the post-war years, as nuclear-age monsters attacked theater screens, Boris turned to his first love, the stage. Returning to Broadway, he gave highly acclaimed performances in The Linden Tree, The Shop at Sly Corner, and in the role that had inspired him to become an actor as his beloved Captain Hook in Peter Pan. While playing the archenemy of the little boy who wouldn't grow up, Karloff began enjoying a growing legion of new fans, children. Far from frightening them, Boris was becoming better known to young audiences as the friendly narrator of countless radio shows and recordings of fairy tales.
Hello there, boys and girls. Are you all ready for another story from your Uncle Boris? It's called Little Red Riding Hood. No, Sarah Jane. It is not about a red-headed hood who is taken for a ride. Shame on you for even thinking of such a thing.
Fast becoming a cultural icon and no longer typed as just a Hollywood monster, Karloff earned his best reviews and a Tony nomination for his brilliant portrayal of Bishop Cochon, the tormentor of Joan of Arc in the 1955 Broadway production of The Lark. He was now prized among his peers as an actor's actor.
He had played on the stage with great distinction. He was Mr. Karloff. I mean, he was Mr. Karloff, but he was highly, highly respected.
But Boris was not one to rest on his laurels, and despite increasing physical problems, the 64-year-old actor sought out fresh challenges in the burgeoning new medium of television.
I had, in the late 50s, done a live television show with him, Playhouse 90, which was Heart of Darkness, and he played Kurtz.
I know you. Take my hand. Quickly.
And I'll never forget him because he was arthritic. He was in great pain, and he would never, ever complain. And it's just very indicative of what he was like.
My ivory, my jungle, my earth, my sun.
Based on the novel by his favorite author, Joseph Conrad, Karloff's portrayal of the mad jungle leader conveyed a depth of talent and emotion unseen in the role until Marlon Brando's interpretation more than 20 years later in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now.
Horror. The horror.
But just as Boris was surprising television viewers with the range and vitality of his numerous performances, it wasn't long before television would play a big surprise on him. Of New York's Dakota Apartments, Boris was completely unprepared for a trick played on him by his friend Ralph Edwards one evening in 1958.
Our honored guest, whom we're about to surprise tonight, is known to all of you as one of the truly great and beloved stars of the theater, motion pictures, radio, and television. Pan the camera quickly, please. He's not coming through those doors because he's seated right there innocently. Tonight, this is your life, Boris Karloff.
He had a moment when they turned the cameras on him, and he, in fact, realized this was his life.
Boris, I think we really put the... Oh, my.
I think my father was horrified.
Hiya, Boris.
He was committed to his privacy.
What do you remember about Boris at the Majestic Theater back in 1919 and 20, Jim?
I can still see Boris sitting in the dressing room hour after hour, working with grease paint, nose putty, crepe hair, and wigs, trying to perfect the art of changing his appearance.
Anything to cover myself up, in other words.
He didn't talk about himself. He hated it. He hated prying into his past. Absolutely hated it. He was very shy and very quiet.
While waiting for that first acting job, how did you make a living?
Well, I cleared land, shoveled coal, laid streetcar tracks, did all sorts of things.
My father never complained about anything. Consequently, had he talked about the difficult periods in his life, I think to him it would have been grousing.
The director of the workshop in Anchorage, Alaska, Frank Brink.
He had a lot of inner pride, but he was not a boastful man.
From the very beginning, Boris became part of the group. Not a star, mind you, Ralph, but just one of us. And when he found out that we were trying to raise the funds, I'm going to tell it because it needs to be told. When he discovered we were trying to raise the funds to build our own theater, he turned over every penny of his percentage of the profits to our building fund.
I know he was genuinely pleased to see Jack Pierce.
Wonderful to see. The best makeup man in the world. What else? I owe him a lot.
This Is Your Life really did a marvelous job in pulling together some special people in my father's life.
From San Francisco, your daughter, Sarah Jane.
But avoiding the past would get even tougher for Boris Karloff. Universal Pictures had started to release their classic monster movies to television in a package called Shock Theater.
It's alive!
The popularity of Shock Theater created a monster craze unlike anything seen before. Late-night horror hosts like Vampira ruled the airwaves. Bobby Boris Pickett recorded a hit single called The Monster Mash. Aurora Plastics issued a line of do-it-yourself monster model kits, and a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland was being scooped up at newsstands across the country.
Kids were seeing a number of monster movies, and that was whetting their appetite. So I created the world's first film monster magazine to show them the artistry of Karloff, or what the man behind the image was really like.
Boris Karloff, king of monsters.
Now in his 70s and more in demand than ever, Karloff was indeed a king.
Let's get you some eyes.
From appearances in fright films like Frankenstein 1970, filmed in 1958, to a weekly television suspense series.
Other screams will soon be heard. Whose? Perhaps yours.
Boris also showed a lighter side on numerous TV variety shows.
I'm very happy to welcome our special guest, Mr. Boris Karloff.
Boris Karloff was a guest star when I was just starting out, and we did a sketch together. I think I was a librarian or something. He was just a mild-mannered man who came in to borrow a book, and of course he scared the hell out of me.
I really wish you wouldn't do that. It frightens me.
And he was very, very unscary in person.
You're making the mistake of mixing me up with the parts that I play in films. In real life, my great interest is in gardening. Why, only today I planted a new flower bed.
Who's under it?
He knew that he was typecast. He made friends with the monster. He always thought he was lucky to be working.
In 1962, Karloff donned the Frankenstein Monster's costume and makeup one last time, appearing with fellow Fright Masters Peter Lorre and Lon Chaney Jr. in a Halloween episode of TV's Route 66. And in theaters, Karloff rounded out another unholy trio.
True terror is the soft, cold caress of the raven's wing.
The Raven and the Comedy of Terrors, a pair of fiendishly funny comedies co-starring Vincent Price and Peter Lorre, had Boris once again spoofing his screen image. But in Mario Bava's Black Sabbath, Karloff proved he could still deliver genuine scares in the first vampire role of his career.
I am hungry.
What the Beatles were to music, Boris was to monsters. There were puppet Borises, robot Borises, even Borises in drag, as when he guest starred on TV's The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. as the murderous Mother Muffin.
I called him and told him, what does he think of doing a woman? He thought it was ripping. He thought that would be jolly. And in the makeup chair, looking in the mirror, all dressed up with the rig on, he said, I look like a $2 whore. And everybody, of course, broke up.
Boris's sense of humor was also utilized by the advertising world, selling everything from steak sauce to cigarette lighters.
If your lighter can't do half the things the Ronson Comet can, get one and have your own torture test.
In 1967, Boris gave one of the best-known and best-loved performances of his career as the voice of the Grinch Who Stole Christmas.
Then he growled with his Grinch fingers, nervously drumming. I must find some way to keep Christmas from coming.
Based on the book by Dr. Seuss and adapted by animator and director Chuck Jones, The Grinch Who Stole Christmas became an instant holiday classic and earned Boris Karloff a Grammy for his recording of the soundtrack album.
He said, if I should win, why don't you accept the prize, put it on your desk, and keep it for me? I did. Boris finally came to the office, and I said, there it is, Boris, pointing to it. There's the Grammy. And he said, it looks like a doorstop. And with that, he picked it up, opened my office door into the reception room, left it open, and put it on the floor as a doorstop. It stayed there for a long, long time, because I'm sentimental when it comes to people like Boris.
Unknown to his fans, Boris endured constant physical pain. He was suffering from emphysema and crippling arthritis. His friends urged him to consider retiring, but for Boris, retirement was out of the question.
The last 10 years of his life, his health was terrible, just terrible. And he would be on the set in a wheelchair. He'd have an oxygen tank nearby. He was a real trooper. He really was.
Although content with his screen image and enjoying the love of his family, friends, and fans, Boris Karloff hoped for one more chance to show the world that he was more than just another screen gargoyle. Imagine his surprise when the chance finally came. Biography's look at Boris Karloff will continue.
My God, Jenny.
Targets, a powerful and shocking story of contemporary violence, spotlighted Karloff as a fading horror actor caught in the crossfire of a random killer.
He did work with us quite a bit on it because it was written for him. I think he just recognized what he could bring to it. crossing the line between who he was and what people believed he was.
The part is you. Sammy, you're a sweet boy, but you can't possibly understand what it feels like to be me. I'm an antique, out of date.
Since this character is very much like me, he says, do I have to say such terrible things about myself? I said, my feeling, Boris, is that the more terrible things you say about yourself, the more the audience will say, no, it's not true, we don't agree. He said, well, I hope so. He said, they might just agree. He said,
oh, Sammy wants the use. Mr. Boogeyman, King of Blood, they used to call me. Marx Brothers make you laugh. Garbo makes you weep. All art makes you scream.
My father is essentially playing himself. And my father felt that the horror was happening on the streets, not up on the screen. That the way man was treating man was the real horror of today's world. And that really is what that film was all about.
Targets was a personal and professional triumph for Karloff, and he considered it his final film, although he continued to work for another year after completing it.
He never considered retiring or quitting. He just wanted to work. It's what he did, it's what he loved to do. And he did it almost until the day he died.
Following a television appearance in 1968, Boris returned to his London home, where he was soon hospitalized with a respiratory infection.
He was fading fast, and I dreamed up one of my typical agent-type lies. I told him how I had this picture in the work for him, and he was going to put on the harness again and go to work. Made him feel good. I wanted him to go out on top.
For the 81-year-old actor who had appeared in more than 200 stage, film, and television roles, the end came on February 2nd, 1969. But for the legions of fans who mourned him around the world, Boris Karloff would never die. His memory lives on as generation after generation rediscovers the legacy of the man and his films.
The devotion that people still have to my father's memory, they're just incredible.
A continuing series of public appearances by Boris's daughter Sarah helps keep the Karloff name alive. And joining her are the families of two of her father's most famous co-stars, Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney.
Bela Jr. and Ron Chaney and I go to conventions and meet people and shake hands and sign autographs. The fans are anxious to tell things that they wish they'd had an opportunity to tell my father. And they are delighted to be able to tell someone close to my father. Some of them are grown people, and some are still youngsters who are becoming familiar with my father's works. Do you know who that is? Who?
Frankenstein.
Right. Would you believe that was my father?
Mm-hmm.
You'd believe it? We made a trip recently to Florida, to Universal Studios, and we did some PR work for them.
Your big smile, ready?
It's great to see my father's face. He was all over the place.
Daddy.
He was on caps and T-shirts and masks and the videos. No one would be more amazed than my father at his continuing fame and popularity and the intense endearment with which he is regarded by his fans and by the people who knew him.
It was only when I met him and has worked with him, I realized how much more there was to it than just those monster creatures that he had been identified with so strongly.
He could have worked in any kind of picture. He would still have been an excellent actor.
He was kind of a genie out of Aladdin's lamp to me, a magic man.
When I think about Boris, the main thing I think of is a kind of dignity and warmth that he projected.
He was such an elegant man. He took everything with such patience.
The kindest and dearest man I've ever known. A really lovely human being.
A gentleman, a real gentle man.
There's a commemorative plaque that was placed after Boris's death at St. Paul's Covent Garden in London, known as the Actors' Church. And the lines were, "He nothing common did or mean upon that memorable scene." That sums up Boris Karloff.
For Boris Karloff, acting was an art form, and his performances bear this out. Now let's see what's coming up next on Biography.